Okay, it is now 3 o'clock and we will go ahead and get started. Um, Good afternoon and thank you for joining our webinar, Understanding Assistive Technology Policy and Implications for State Leaders. This is the first webinar of the Summer 2016 workshop series for the Southern Regional Education Board's Educational Technology Cooperative. I'm Wanda Barker, Director of the EdTech Cooperative, and our cooperative works with state-level representatives of EdTech in K-12, community colleges, and university-level state agencies in the 16-state region for the Southern Regional Education Board. Our goal is to create a culture of collaboration in order to improve K-20 education through technology research, best practices, and policy. Our webinar today is sponsored by the Center on Technology and Disability. Our speakers are Tracy Gray and Elise Crossland. Tracy is Managing Director at the American Institutes for Research, is a nationally recognized expert in the implementation of assistive and educational technology to enhance teaching and learning. She's led 4 national centers funded by the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. Dr. Gray currently directs AIR's efforts with the Center on Technology and Disability to provide materials, tools, and resources to state education agencies, local education agencies, and other key stakeholders to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And I will tell you, Dr. Gray has many more accolades than we even have time to describe today. So, Tracy, we are so glad to have you here. Our next guest is Elise Crossland. Elise is a senior researcher at AIR with more than 13 years of experience identifying and assessing digital learning technologies for both general and special education. Her work focuses on providing technical assistance and professional development to educators at the local, state, and national level on the use of technology tools to facilitate access to academic content for students with disabilities to ensure that all students are college and career ready. Elise's current work includes the design, development, and creation of interactive content and platforms, professional development materials, technology guides, and research briefs on the use of AT, or assistive technology, and IT to improve student outcomes. She's actively engaged in creating a variety of learning materials for SEAs, LEAs, and classroom teachers to build capacity for more effectively utilizing technology to support students with disabilities for the Center on Technology and Disability. So a few logistics before we turn over the reins for the Center on Technology and Disability. All of the mics of the participants are muted. That's so that we won't have any background noise. We know how busy you can be in your office, people walk in your office or the phone rings. So as you have questions, please enter them in the chat window, and we're going to try to keep up with that and answer the questions as we go along. We'll also reserve a little bit of time at the end of the webinar to ask a few additional questions. We are so happy for you to be here with us today to learn more about assistive technology, and so thankful for Tracy and Elise. We appreciate what the Center on Technology and Disability is doing with the SREB EdTech Cooperative, because it is important and is a critical issue for us to address accessibility and assistive technology for students with special needs in K-20 education. So, Tracy and Elise, I'll let you take over.
Well, thanks so much, Wanda. This is Tracy, and we are just delighted to have the opportunity to work with you and your colleagues on this important effort. We here at the Center on Technology and Disabilities are always looking forward to this type of direct opportunity to really work with people who are working as state leaders, working to really make sure that technology leverages its potential and works to help all students. Our focus is particularly for students with disabilities. So let's just quickly look at our agenda today. Elise and I are going to be focused on assistive technology basics. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about the future of assistive technology. Where is this field going? And we'll also be focusing on the intersection of assistive technology and instructional technology. We're going to be talking about assistive technology policy issues. Why should you care about these issues? What does this mean for you in your capacity as state leaders? And what are the policy implications of the evolution of assistive technology? And moving on to the last item, and that is those implications for state leaders looking to today and also looking forward as we think about the new legislation that was recently passed, the ESSA, and other legislation that has implication for state leaders such as yourselves. So moving forward, what we wanted to do is to just get a sense of who has joined us today. And if you could just take a minute to tell us what level of education you represent and select one of the three options. So are you working with K-12? Are you at the community college level or the university level? So please take a minute to tell us who you are. And Wanda is our great poll navigator, so she's going to tell us what the results show from our poll.
Okay, 92% of you have voted. We'll give you another second to get that last vote in. Okay, so we'll close the poll and then share the results. And it looks like we're slightly higher on the K-12 than the community college and university level.
Well, that's helpful, and also it will help us get a really broad sweep as we move into our topics today in our discussion.
Great.
So why don't we look at understanding the basics of assistive technology. As I'm sure many of you are familiar, in terms of definitions, when we think of technology, we often think about specific devices. These can be items that are considered assistive technology or pieces of equipment. They could be products, whether they've been acquired commercially or off the shelf. Oftentimes, depending upon the needs of the student, these assistive technology devices are modified or customized to meet the individual needs of students or of the users. And that's the definition that you can find in the Technology Related Assistance Act of 2004. And that's important to think about as a backdrop, if you will, or as a baseline, because as you're going to be hearing as we talk about assistive technology and its convergence with IT, we're going to see how that definition really has morphed into different types of devices, different types of services, different types of products that are now available given the increased development of tools that are available on the web. And then when we think about assistive technology, an assistive technology service, we're talking about any service or activity that directly assists an individual user with a disability, particularly in a selected environment, and the use of that assistive technology device. So when we think about K-12 education, that also has changed in terms of what a service might look like. many years past, students with special needs would go to a resource room where they would receive AT services that would be directed to meet their special needs. As we find that over 60% of students with disabilities spend 80% or more in general ed classes, this notion of what a service is has morphed because the services are provided in general education classes and tend to be part of the students' integration into the general ed community. So when we look at the different categories of AT devices, what we wanted to do was just provide you, again, a high-level overview of the different types of assistive technology products that are out there. One category is something referred to as alternative and augmentative communication devices. Those are devices that are created to help students who may be deaf or hard of hearing or have other communication disabilities. They're aids to provide enhanced access to computers, whether they're desktops or other types of devices, which allow for alternative input or output. Specialized software, we're going to be talking about text-to-speech or other types of support. And then, of course, we have vision or reading aids, which enable the user to receive the text in a way that allows them to use the text, whether it's through increasing the font size or increasing the background, but ensuring that they're able to access it depending upon what their specific disability might be. And then we also talk about those categories that are not necessarily school or classroom related, having to do with environmental controls or transportation aids. And those are ways that allow users to access a car, even though they might have a disability, or to have environmental controls that allow them, again, to be able to do something that they might not normally be able to do depending upon their disability. We oftentimes, when we think about different types of assistive technology, we distinguish between low tech, which could relate to motor or mechanical devices to enhance a student's ability to read, such as you can see, we've got some devices, grips to hold pens or pencils. We have on a scissor a way that allows a student with a particular disability to actually use that tool. There are other kinds of low-tech, such as highlighter tape, or things that you don't necessarily need to plug in, if you will. When we look at medium types of assistive technology, we find things like portable keyboards that are featured there, or speaking homework wizards. Again, these are relatively simple devices. They've been around for quite a while, and they allow students with disabilities to communicate in very relatively low-tech ways. And then, of course, when we move on to high-tech, that's where you're talking about advanced text-to-speech devices, text readers, visual manipulatives, and other kinds of devices. Also on many PCs today, whether it's a Mac or a regular PC, there are built-in accessibility features that allow the user to benefit from the use of the technology. So moving forward, when we think about examples of AT in the school or in institutional settings, again, when we think about communication support, we're talking about augmentative and assistive communication devices, boards, text-to-speech software. All of these kinds of tools enhance the communication ability for students depending upon what their needs are. We also think about writing software, word prediction tools, note-taking devices, all of which can be used for students throughout their educational experience. We have these kinds of tools being used in K-12 settings, but also in post-secondary environments where students need this type of support to be successful in school. In terms of computer access, and of course we've seen a great burgeoning of this type of access over the years, eye tracking software, head pointers where students who are not able to use their hands on a keyboard are able to connect a device to their head, and they're able to point to the particular items to communicate, and then using voice inputs where they're able to talk and create the text. Alternative keyboards, depending upon what the needs of the user are, to deal with other types of disabilities, and also, again, the voice input and the speech-to-text tools. We've been at this, Elise and I, for the last 15 years, who's counting, and the emergence and sophistication and ease of these devices has been quite significant over the years. It used to be you would go to a convention, and in the hallway, in the halls where they showed these devices, many times a screen reader would take up a whole desk or a whole table, a device that would allow students who are visually impaired to be able to access the written text. And now, of course, devices have gotten much more compact and are much more easy to both navigate, and in terms of cost, they have been significantly reduced. So now we're talking about a future-ready assistive technology, and Elise, I'm going to hand that over to you so you can talk about where we are headed.
Sure. Thanks, Tracy. It was actually a good lead-in because, as Tracy mentioned, you know, having been working in this field for the last 15 or so years, there's been significant changes in what assistive technology looks like. And certainly, you know, we've gone from things that were often very expensive or very large standalone devices, particularly when we're talking about assistive and augmentative communication devices. They were often these sort of laptop-sized boards, and with the advent of the iPad and the iPhone and the development of apps for AAC, somebody can now use these similar type communication boards through software like ProLogo2Go on an iPad. And it's something that they'll have with them every day, and it's not quite so expensive to buy. Those big communication boards used to be anywhere in the range from $8,000 to $15,000 or sometimes more. And you know how much an iPad costs, and the software itself is about $200. So there's a lot of shifting going on in assistive technology from standalone devices or software that were highly specialized and very expensive to things that you can purchase commercially off the shelf. Some of them are free apps or very inexpensive apps. So that's been a big shift. And certainly part of that has been driven by the advances in mainstream technology tools, the fact that everybody has a smartphone, or most everybody has a smartphone in their pockets. Many of us used touch screens. I remember working with students many years ago, and we had to buy special devices that would fit on top of the computer screen in order to turn a student's computer into a touch screen. And now it's just something that many of us take for granted, that everything we use has a touch screen. In addition, many of these mainstream technology tools have also built in accessibility features that we used to have to purchase separately, things like speech-to-text, text-to-speech, for example. And those are all things that we just expect in many of the technologies that we use now to use voice input, for example, to write in Google Docs. And you can also customize a lot of the mainstream technology now with very custom designed apps. There's a pretty large community out there of makers and hackers that work with people with disabilities to create open source apps or to create, very simple tools to solve a problem. And previously, that would have been very expensive to create your own software. And many more people have access to those types of tools to create an app that solves the problem just for them. And they may then share that and find that other people need it. But whereas before AT took so long and so much money to develop, people often couldn't get those sorts of customized solutions that were appropriate maybe for just 1 or 2 people or 10 people or 15 people. So a lot has changed in the way that we think about assistive technology. And so some of those things I touched on a little bit, but there's been a lot of emerging technology that has really been a game changer for assistive technology and technology for people with disabilities in general, with smaller and less expensive hardware, reductions in power needs, and things being much more affordable and smaller power sources so that we can now carry the equivalent of a computer in our pockets. And developments in user interfaces. I mentioned touchscreen, but there's also a lot going on with gesture recognition and apps that use gesture recognition to translate on the fly when somebody is using sign language and immediately translate it. So that people with sign language can use these apps to communicate even if they're trying to talk to somebody who is not familiar with sign language. There are brain interfaces that can actually read your brain waves to control your computer, and students with disabilities are using this to write music or develop their own games. Haptic feedback is another one. You can get sort of vibrations, and that's being used a lot to help guide people who have vision impairments and create tools that will give them vibrations to let them know which direction they need to go in. I also talked a little bit in the previous slide about the impact of open source and maker communities and hackers. And people who are involved in assistive technology have always been sort of crafty DIY type people, do-it-yourself makers, because they had to be. You would build things out of cardboard if you had to prop up a student's computer so that they could get just the right angle or adjust thing. And that's been pushed into the future with the opportunity to easily develop an app or to use 3D printers, for example, to build your own device or to build your own tool that you want to be able to use. And consumer level access to these types of tools, whether it's Raspberry Pi or app development tools or 3D printers, means that more and more people can get in on this and say, I have a need and I don't have to wait for somebody else to create this. I can make myself a tool or work with others to create a tool that really fits the learning or employment needs that I have. And so some of these things are not in your classrooms yet, but they're coming. They're certainly on the mainstream market. I mentioned haptic feedback. There are these really cool sneakers that you can buy, haptic sneakers that were developed by a man in India to serve the needs of the rather large blind population in India. They're available for less than $100. And you can sync them up with your GPS, and they provide blind people navigation throughout school buildings or throughout the street, and will tell them which way to go. So it allows people to travel on their own without the need for, say, a guide dog or somebody to come along with them.
That is very cool, Elise. I hadn't heard of that.
They're very cool, and they're actually becoming popular with tourists going to a new city, so they don't have to, they're being used by people who are not blind. They're available online for anybody, but because you can get directions and not be that tourist that's standing in the middle of a city looking at your phone or looking at a map, you can just walk and look around. I mentioned brain-computer interfaces. These are becoming more and more common. They're being used by people both with and without disabilities. But they're a way for people to be able to communicate and use a computer even when everything else may have been off limits to them. I mentioned translation apps in terms of sign language, but there's also a brand new translation app for people with speech disorders that is capable of recognizing, it learns the person's speech patterns. So even if the person has had a stroke or has some other kind of speech issue, it learns their patterns and what their sounds might mean and translates that for new people, so that if somebody is going out in public and wants to be able to communicate but is concerned that they may be difficult to understand, they can use this translation app. I don't know if any of you have seen or are familiar with some of the nonprofits that do custom designed and 3D printed prosthetics, but there's Enabling the Future is one such group, and people on the consumer level are using their 3D printers all over the world to create custom designed prosthetics for people for free. Refreshable Braille is another example of something that used to be a gigantic device that you would carry around that cost a fortune. And they now have refreshable Braille smartwatches, so you can check your email and get it all in Braille on your wrist, as well as pocket-sized refreshable Braille devices. And then, there's smart scheduling apps that are learning. They're capable of making decisions. So to help people with executive functioning issues or autism, if one appointment runs a little bit late and that would normally throw off their whole schedule and they're not sure how to respond to it, the app actually learns and helps them readjust their schedule to deal with being late or an appointment being moved or rescheduled. And so it helps people with ADD and with autism be able to better deal with sort of inconsistencies in their schedule and not have that cause panic or anxiety. And as I said, all of these things sound sort of science fiction-y. A lot of them do, but they're all commercially available right now, and many of them very cheaply. So what that means for special ed is that these rapid shifts in technology have changed mainstream technology for all of us. We all use assistive technology every day without thinking about it. I talk to my phone constantly and use voice recognition to dictate things or to ask a question or whatever. We use text-to-speech every time we use our GPS. And we're making use of these tools, and they're becoming really blurred. And so they don't feel like assistive technology anymore, but that was where they started from. And these changes will continue to shape the future of how we think about special education. And they present a lot of new opportunities for people with disabilities because of the ability for us to be able to customize things so readily, a lot of open source materials, a lot of a very active community online that is helping people create apps or working together to make things more accessible or to create new AT devices. But there's also a lot of new challenges presented by these technologies. Because the pace moves so quickly, they aren't always accessible, barriers aren't always thought of, and so we can't assume that just because there's these brand new exciting technology tools that they're always going to be necessarily accessible or beneficial for our students with disabilities. The ability to learn anytime and anywhere is a huge shift that will have a profound impact on students with disabilities, both because it enables them to learn in a new way, and certainly for students who may have mobility issues, being able to learn from home is great, but it also changes the way we need to think about whether the student is in the least restrictive environment. An online classroom, for example, can be thought of as both being inclusive for a student with disabilities because it's giving them access to loads of technology and accessibility features, but it also may be exclusive if it means that that student is no longer being integrated with their peers and instead they're spending all their time at home alone learning and not having that opportunity for social interaction. And also many of these online learning platforms may not necessarily be accessible or may not be compatible with assistive technology. So there's a lot happening that we need to think about as these technologies are really shifting the way we think about AT. And so being able to understand the direction that the technology is headed in and where opportunities are and where challenges are will really be imperative for state education leaders as you start to think about the procedures and policies and guidance that you're giving to districts and schools in your state about what does special education look like as we move forward into this future, as we have more and more students learning in online learning environments. Are we providing a least restrictive environment for those students? And what does least restrictive environment even mean? What does placement mean when it's all online? And I don't have any brilliant answers to those questions yet. Nobody does, really, because so many of these things are so new. But it's something that we do need to think about, and particularly with issues of student privacy, with more and more students learning online or more and more students using smart devices and connected devices, particularly with students with disabilities. We really want to make sure that we're protecting their privacy. So there's a lot of challenges, but it's also very exciting and with a lot of opportunities for students to improve their learning. So the big question for you all and state leaders in general is whether I'm stealing from the Office of Education Technology here and saying, are you future ready? And do you have the types of systems and procedures in place or the infrastructure in place to deal with the future of students who are potentially all coming to school with some type of smart device, or I don't know if some of you have heard of the Internet of Things, but these are connected devices. And the most obvious example right now is smartwatches. Many adults with disabilities are using smartwatches in combination with a variety of apps to meet specific needs. People who are deaf may use them as ways of picking up on sounds within a building and then alerting them to something or letting them know that there's a fire alarm. Or there's one I read about, a fascinating deaf woman who combined her smartwatch and an app and her smartphone and environmental controls in her house to flash lights and give her an alert when her baby cried. She trained the app to recognize the sound of her baby crying. So a lot of these things are mainstream technology tools that some schools still say, oh, we don't want students to have mobile devices. They're a distraction. And so do you need to rethink mobile device policies as rather than our traditional, what we used to think about for assistive technology, it's a standalone, it's clearly AT. Many of these students may be starting to come in with more mainstream devices and saying, this is my AT, because it's got all the apps that I need, it's got a smart schedule, it does this for me, it does that, but it's also an iPhone. And so we need to rethink, some of our mobile phone policies and when things are distractions and when they're actually AT. I mentioned privacy as we continue to collect increasing amounts of data on students as they're learning online, if they're using smart devices, if they're using some of these new technologies like brain-computer interfaces, you're potentially collecting data on their emotional responses to things, and how do we need to create data policies and safety policies and security policies as we move towards that. And how do we serve students with disabilities in online learning? I talked a little bit about that, but there's a real need for concrete guidance. A lot of districts or a lot of schools that are doing online learning have expressed in some of the great work done by the Center for Online Learning for Students with Disabilities that they just don't know the answer. They're not quite sure how much data they should share across platforms or with teachers who are teaching online. They're not sure whether how a student's IEP works in an online learning platform, and they're really hungry for some guidance on those key issues. Now I'll switch over to another quick poll, give you all a break after lots of talking there.
Thanks, Elise. So this is just a poll to find out, how aware you are of the number of Americans that report having some type of disability. So just click true or false. We'll see what you think and then launch the poll results.
Wanda, I love these polls. They're just great.
I'm so glad. Thanks. So 92% of you have voted. I think that was about what we had last time. So we'll share the results of that poll. And most people believe that's true.
It is indeed true, which is why it's so important to think about these things at every level, whether
Yeah.
it's in K-12, whether it's in the workforce, whether it's in post-secondary education.
So we have some pretty
There are
savvy people in our audience today, don't we?
Okay, so as I said, this is incredibly important for a number of reasons, not the least because there are 1 in 5 people in this country with some type of disability, whether that's an invisible disability or one that's more obvious to us. So we always need to be thinking about these issues and how we're meeting the needs of students with disabilities, both because it's the right thing to do and because it's the law, which is what we're going to talk about next. So we're not going to go too deep into each of these, but we really wanted to sort of show the evolution of legislation related to assistive technology. If we go all the way back to 1973 with the Rehab Act, each one of these pieces of federal legislation have set the stage for sort of the next round and set the stage for the continuing evolution of how we're thinking about technology, sort of first starting with making accommodations for things, and then thinking about, assistive technology as we get into the AT Act in 1998, talking about making accommodations and not leaving students out of accountability measures and assessments with No Child Left Behind, really digging further into you are required to provide AT for students who need it. You're required to consider assistive technology for students with disabilities as part of the IEP process, and working into the Higher Education Opportunity Act and Every Student Succeeds Act, which both put a heavy emphasis on universal design for learning and thinking about accessibility and making sure that all educational opportunities and programs are accessible and open to students with disabilities. And so each one of these pieces really tells the story of this long evolution and this continuing understanding of making sure that we are not excluding people with disabilities from learning opportunities from educational programs. At the K-12 level, there's been a shift that corresponds with some of this shifting thinking and shifting technology with the blending and blurring of mainstream technology and assistive technology. So as these two have sort of come together and they've really impacted how we use technology every day, the federal K-12 policy landscape has really focused on thinking about innovative ways to leverage technology for learning for all students, with initiatives like ConnectEd and Future Ready Schools and the National Education Technology Plan that was just published this year. There's a big focus on universal design for learning, on using technology to ensure that learning opportunities are available for all students, whether they're students with disabilities, whether they're students who are learning English as a second language, whether they're students who come from low-income neighborhoods, finding ways to use technology to reach multiple students and in multiple ways with an underpinning of focusing on universal design for learning. Results-driven accountability has really focused on ensuring that we're using evidence-driven instruction for students with disabilities. And the connection there with technology is many of these programs enable us to collect extraordinary amounts of data on how students are learning, how they're interacting with the technology. And so we can really start to think about how we're using and choosing technology tools for students with disabilities, and not just sort of saying, well, they've got a learning disability, so I guess we'll give them text-to-speech, or I guess we'll give them, a digital highlighter, and really starting to use some of the tools that we have to pinpoint which types of technology tools are best for which students and under which circumstances and in which settings. And with the Every Student Succeeds Act, one exciting piece of it is that it's the first federal general education law that really endorses universal design for learning for all students. When I used to go to conferences many years ago, if I was presenting to special educators and I'd say, has anyone heard of universal design for learning? Everybody had. If I talked to general educators, maybe one hand would go up. And to see this now become part of the general education landscape and more states putting this in their plans as part of results-driven accountability, this is the way that we're going to meet student needs, is by focusing on learning opportunities for all students that are accessible to everybody, is really pretty amazing. And it's also given states increased flexibility to develop their own plans for innovation and school improvement. So all these things sort of come together to create a really exciting landscape for states and schools and districts to start to use technology in an innovative way to meet the needs of diverse learners. If we're talking about higher ed, similar pattern with making sure that we're protecting students who would otherwise be qualified, and to do so with accommodations, providing additional clarification in 2008 on actually too many students were getting excluded in the definition of disability, and broadening those definitions and allowing more students to have access to accommodations in AT, and providing some clarification as technology really starts to change in the form of a Dear Colleague letter on electronic book readers. And this actually applies to both, it was directed at higher ed, but it applies down at K-12, and it applies to all technology beyond ebook readers, although it was initially written in response to ebook readers that were inaccessible because they didn't have the ability to have the text read aloud to students who are blind. And some of the key points of this is that it doesn't matter if you're using technology as part of a small pilot program. It doesn't matter if it's brand new. It doesn't matter if you don't have any students who are blind. All of these new technology tools, if we're using them with our students, they must be accessible, regardless of whether you have a student in your class who needs that accessibility, or regardless of whether you're just testing it out with 10 or 12 students to start, you still need to make sure that you're using accessible technology. And so I sort of touched on this. I just wanted to provide the specific quote that it's a continuing legal obligation, that the Department of Education was of the opinion that this is not a new interpretation of ADA, but that this is a continuing understanding and clarification of going all the way back to the ADA, that we have a legal obligation to provide equal opportunity to students with disabilities, whether or not these are brand new technologies. So I'm going to end this section with just a little quote here from the Department of Justice and Department of Education that talks about this. But it really serves as a stark reminder that these emerging technologies have a lot of benefits for students with disabilities. It's very exciting, the things that we can do now that we were not able to do, or we had to work very hard to do even 10 years ago, but that we do need to make sure that in that excitement we don't lose the responsibility and the obligation to make sure that new technology is accessible to our students with disabilities. And so I'm going to hand it over to Tracy, and actually, because I'm controlling slides, I haven't been able to see the chat, but I know Tracy will jump in if anyone has any questions. But now Tracy's going to talk about sort of what this all means for you.
And thanks so much, Elise.
Sure.
As you can see, Elise really touched on not only what's available today, but also what's available really just around the corner as we all experience what seemed to be something that almost seems science fiction in the past, has really become, for many people, part of their everyday life, how they, particularly individuals with disabilities, how they're able to maneuver both physically and cognitively to really benefit from the exciting developments in technology. So really, what does this all mean for you? Well, as Elise talked about, again, the provision of assistive technology and related services is a legal requirement, whether we're talking about K-12 education or community college level or post-secondary education in general. Students and individuals are, by law, entitled to receive technology support and services to enable them to access curriculum and to be able to partake in educational opportunities. A related issue is that technology purchases must consider accessibility as one of the criteria for selection. So those individuals who are responsible for acquiring that technology, and we know that people oftentimes talk about just being bombarded with the choices and the difficulty of considering all of the necessary variables to make appropriate choices. Well, in fact, accessibility to meet the needs of students with disability is one of the criteria that needs to be factored in with those purchasing decisions. Another thing to think about is that mainstream devices, as Elise was talking about, the ones that are in our pockets or the ones that are on our desk, and AT devices, when we talk about students with disabilities, may require changes in learning spaces or infrastructure, or sometimes in funding. In other words, depending upon what the needs are of the student, those who are making these decisions need to ensure that the physical space and the necessary infrastructure is in place to allow the students to access this technology. One of the challenges that we see, particularly in K-12 education, primarily because of the source of funding, that there is the pot of funds that are set aside for purchases and infrastructure related to instructional technology or educational technology. And then over on the other side, you have the funds for assistive technology. And what happens in too many instances, even today, is that having that type of siloing or bifurcated system does not maximize the ability for those devices to work together. And oftentimes they don't work in conjunction, and it really creates hardships for the end user, and also hardships for those people who are trying to build the back-end infrastructure. And then lastly, thinking about new technologies and looking at the things that Elise was talking about, trying to rethink how those tools fit with special education policies and procedures. We're still seeing that many education policies and procedures have not caught up with the new technologies that are available. The notion of requiring evidence, an evidence base for purchasing devices, oftentimes the evidence has not kept up with the devices because they tend to be changing, and in some instances, whether it's a device or a particular product or an app, there may not be, or a program, there may not be this type of gold standard information in terms of effectiveness that one would hope to have in order to make an informed purchasing decision. So oftentimes there's a disconnect between what the research offers and the need to make decisions in real time. So those are all things that individuals who are decision makers have to think about. But in the end, it is the law. So when we think about technology advances, increases in funding on technology to support teaching and learning, it also means that folks at the state level and at the local level really have the opportunity to think about approaching these issues and challenges in exciting and different ways. We've been talking a lot about ways to blend and braid funding streams to ensure that students have access to innovative technologies. Thinking about developing plans for school improvement and taking those school improvement funds or quality enhancement plans to combine technology tools that offer high quality instruction to drive improved outcomes. And really maximizing learning resources. We all, I'm sure, could cite examples of technology tools and products that are sitting in closets, wasting away, either because there isn't the IT infrastructure to make them work effectively, or because there isn't the necessary support, tech support, to deal with those devices that need repairs. So it's really about maximizing learning resources and making sure that those who are responsible for deploying them to students, whether it's teachers or other support staff, know how to use those devices and have the ongoing professional development to be successful in the deployment and integration of those resources in learning environments. And finally, thinking about ensuring that students with disabilities are receiving not only equal access to the particular tools, but of equal import is equal access to challenging learning experiences. Because in the end, just putting a child in front of a computer and wishing them well is not necessarily going to leverage the power of the technology tool. So here are some questions to consider, and these tie in with the issues that we've been talking about. How can you leverage multiple funding sources for new technologies? When is technology assistive? When is mainstream technology the right choice for students? And how will funds be used to acquire these devices and to integrate them into the classroom? Thinking about policies. What policies do we need to ensure so that students have equitable access to technology? And then focusing on this concept of the least restrictive environment. How do we change the boundaries to learning so that we can make sure that whether it's in a real-time traditional face-to-face classroom or learning in virtual spaces, how can we make sure that all students are really able to benefit from these opportunities? And finally, what kinds of policies are in place to support the use of accessible digital content and open educational resources? As we know, over the last 5 years, there's been an enormous proliferation of open educational resources, but there hasn't been a sufficient amount of thinking about whether these OERs, as they're called, are actually accessible for students with disabilities. So educators need to really think about these questions as they figure out what their new technology plan is going to look like, or how they're going to enhance a plan that's already in place. So where do we go from here, and how do we get there? What are the things to be thinking about? And we've basically touched upon these issues about breaking down the silos and building bridges between technology teams, our AT specialists, special and general educators, to really leverage the power and the potential of these technology tools and resources and services. Recently, I had the opportunity to talk to a group of the best and the brightest, if you will, COOs or CTOs, Chief Technology Officers. And when I wrote up the summary of what we were going to be talking about, I used the abbreviation of AT. And the folks who were planning the conference got back to me, and they were a little sheepish in telling me that in fact they didn't think their participants even though they were the best out there, would not know what AT stood for. So that was a real reality check for all of us who have been working in this field. The notion of assistive technology and its linkage to instructional technology is still something that we all need to learn about and to figure out ways to really maximize the power of these tools. Again, investing in planning, budgeting, and building infrastructure to make sure that the technology is going to work for students with disabilities, and establishing systems for statewide collaboration between general and special education educators to ensure that there's the effective use of assistive and instructional technology. And then again, focusing on that blending and braiding of funding resources to create professional development around the use of technology to benefit all students. So I know that's a lot to be putting out there, and it's a lot of things to think about, but we'd like you to really focus on your unique role in helping to set this agenda and the vision, particularly at the state level, to think about your role in guiding discussions to rethink, reshape, and redesign both special and general education. And then second, to ensure that new technologies are in compliance with federal disability law. And finally, to create supportive structures that use technology to meet the needs of all students, particularly students with disabilities, to make sure that these students have fair and equitable access to valuable and high-quality learning opportunities. So let's go back to our last poll, and this question has to do with who manages assistive technology services at your institution or school. And you can see we've got 5 different options here, and we'd love to get your feedback about who actually is responsible, because we know that there's great variation across the country.
So about 70% have voted. Another few seconds and we will close the poll.
Wanda, the next time we're going to need to get that TikTok music that they always play when people take polls.
Yeah, from Jeopardy.
That's right. So it looks like we've got 50% of our participants today talking about having IT staff, which is very interesting. And then also having 50% who talk about special education staff. So obviously we have instances where people are voting more than once because there is more than one set of staff who are responsible for this. And then disability services staff. That's very interesting. Very interesting indeed.
Yes, and thank you all for voting.
Yes, absolutely. So I didn't see any questions, and I apologize. They're not showing up on my little panel here to the right. I'm not sure if I missed anything. Could you?
I've been checking. I've been checking for the questions, Tracy, and I haven't seen any posted.
Ah, okay. Well, hopefully that means that we've addressed your questions. We are hoping that you will fill out our survey if you haven't done that already, and that also on August 16th, you'll join us for our next webinar, Understanding Accessibility, where we'll have the opportunity to really dig down deeper into these issues. And then if you have any questions at all, we would love to hear from you. You can see you've got our email addresses up there. And we'd also strongly encourage you to share this webinar. Wanda is going to post it on the website. So share it with your colleagues or with people who would be interested. And let us hear from you if there are any questions or issues that you would like to hear us talk about. And we'd love to know what's going on where in your workplace in terms of addressing these issues to really leverage the power of technology. Elise, do you have any parting words?
I do. We're going to be posting a link in the chat for a follow-up survey after this webinar that we'd appreciate it if you could fill out. It'll take no more than just a few minutes. And I also want to call people's attention to the 2 handouts that you can access, both the slides from this webinar and an article or guide that we wrote a few months ago on future-ready assistive technology that really goes deeper into where the field is headed, some of the new tools that are available, and what that means for state leaders in terms of policy and thinking about funding and infrastructure. We also will be sharing a link, Tracy, if you could paste that in, for signing up for our newsletter for the Center on Technology and Disability if you'd like to receive occasional updates and resources and guides that are specifically developed for state leaders thinking about technology. You'll be able to sign up for our newsletter there.
And Jillian, could you just put that in the box to share? That would be great. And again, our thanks to all of you for participating, and we look forward to working with you as we move into the next set of webinars and also materials that we're going to be sharing throughout the next several months. And our thanks to Wanda for helping to organize this and for launching this great partnership. So thank you, Wanda, for all of your support and help.
You are quite welcome. It has been my pleasure, and I appreciate you, Tracy and Elise, and your staff for working with us for the materials that you've provided us, and the future webinar and ongoing partnership. I know that this is going to be a great benefit to the SREB EdTech Cooperative. So thank you very much. And thank you all in the audience.
Thank you.
Okay.